The very provocative title, which you just heard for this lecture, in fact comes from an early theosophical text, as Dr. Aljo has mentioned, called the Mahatma Letters. These are letters which were sent by two individuals believed by the Theosophical tradition to be masters of the wisdom, generally inaccessible to ordinary humankind. The Master Kuthumi, or K.H., as he usually signed himself, and the Master Morya, or M. And they were addressed, for the most part, to A.P. Sinnett, a journalist in India who was very interested in the 1880s in the study of theosophical lore. These letters have since been published in a couple of collections. The passage about which I'm going to speak is from letter number 10, or number 88, I believe it is in the more recent chronological edition, and was received by A.P. Sinnett in September of 1882. And in this famous or notorious passage, the Master K.H. stated, "I will point out the greatest, the chief cause of nearly 2/3 of the evils that pursue humanity ever since that cause became a power. It is religion, under whatever form and in whatsoever nation." Now, just before this passage, K.H. had made out a devastating, powerfully worded case for human selfishness as the cause of 1/3 of evil, showing in a few well-aimed thrusts how excess in what are of themselves, quote, natural necessities of life, food, sexual relations, drink, bring on misery, disease, suffering, mental and physical. But all this is only 1/3 of humanity's evil. Again, what of the rest? The Master then says, and I quote, "It is the sacerdotal caste, the priesthood and the churches. It is in those illusions that man looks upon as sacred that he has to search out the cause of that multitude of evils, which is the great curse of humanity and that almost overwhelms mankind. Look at India, and look at Christendom and Islam, at Judaism and fetishism. It is priestly imposture that rendered these gods so terrible to man. It is religion that makes of him the selfish bigot, the fanatic that hates all mankind out of his own sect, without rendering him any better or more moral for it. It is belief in God and gods that make 2/3 of humanity the slaves of a handful of those who deceive them under the false pretense of saving them." And he goes on to tell of the crimes people are willing to commit if convinced that these crimes are the will of God, of peasants who will support their religion though their families starve, of the evils of caste in India and holy war between Christians and Muslims, for the greater glory, as he put it, of their respective myths. K.H. then goes on to argue a little less convincingly that the temples, lamas, and bhikkhus of Buddhism are uniquely exempt from this resounding condemnation, though rightly pointing out that they do not worship a tyrannical God in the Western sense of the word, and that their meditation calls up superhuman but not supernatural qualities. Indeed, in the opening to this same letter, the Master said, "Neither our philosophy nor ourselves believe in God, least of all one whose pronoun necessitates a capital H. The idea of God," he goes on to say, "is not an innate but an acquired notion. All that we have in common with theology is that both they and we reveal the infinite. But what the infinite is another and deeper question." Now, what are we to make of this case about evil and religion as the cause of 2/3 of evil? First, we must have a clear idea of what is connoted by evil. As with religion and other broadly sweeping words, a number of definitions are no doubt possible. These are the kind of big words that we think we know the meaning of until we are forced to offer a really precise, careful definition of what they include and what they do not include, and then we find that they become awfully slippery. But I would like to start with a very simple depiction of what we mean by evil that actually closely matches the one just presented in the Mahatma Letters under consideration. that evil is that which prevents any being from completing its natural life cycle, and so prevents it from fulfilling all its natural potential for love, wisdom, and glory built into its nature. The child who dies of disease, abuse, or war before reaching maturity. The calf taken from its mother at birth and raised in a pen so tiny it can't fully turn around, until slaughtered for veal after a miserable year or so. Those who, though they may live, are so stunted by ignorance, poverty, and illness that much of what is in them was never allowed to unfold. The Master K.H. says that the cause of all such evil is not nature, but man, whose intelligence, he says, makes him the one free agent in nature. Death itself, at the right time, is, quote, no evil but a necessary law, and a human being's mission and destiny in the economy of nature is to die his natural death brought on by old age. The disease, the starvation, the violence, and whatever else defeats that pattern to cut short human, and I would add animal, fulfillment of the life cycle implanted in our nature is due not to nature, but to the selfishness, the callousness, and the illusions of humanity itself. Now, of course, one can, from the perspective of other theosophical texts, even other Mahatma Letters, go behind this flat assertion that humans are the cause of all that evil, to ask why humans find themselves in a position of being so susceptible to evil in the first place. The Secret Doctrine, for example, explains that the ultimate origin of evil lies in the breakdown of the original outflow of creation into subject and object, into spirit and matter. This does not mean that matter in itself is evil, but rather that the dualism of matter and spirit limits both, and so creates causes of conflict and impediment. Evolutionary necessity, we are told, is likewise viewed as a source of suffering or evil, stemming from that dualism. And karma is presented as a cause of suffering, the cause and effect that is necessary on the plane of manyness when the original oneness breaks down into many often competing parts. Initiation is further presented as a cause of suffering in the sense that painful experience can be a requisite part of gaining wisdom and status as an enlightened being or great soul, even up to the horrendous fourth initiation of utter aloneness, so vividly described by C.W. Ledbetter. Black magic can also cause evil. The Mahatma Letters refer from time to Dugpas, Tibetan black magicians, who can cause a great deal of localized evil. And even to the Mamo Chohans, the imperfect gods, or rather black magicians on a cosmic scale, who play a dominant role in the larger cycles of the dissolution of ages and worlds. Finally, both Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, the two basic texts of H.P. Blavatsky, devote much attention to a complex and controversial argument based on ancient Gnosticism that Jehovah and Satan are one and the same, in turn identical with the Gnostic Ildebaoth, an arrogant but lower demiurgic deity, less than the supreme and unconditioned Lord of Light. It was this upstart, incompetent God who created this world and botched the job, in the process entrapping higher souls in ill-fitting material shells and sowing the seeds of the evils of our imperfect realm. Nonetheless, Theosophy clearly teaches that whatever predisposing causes and circumstances there may be, humankind, including you and I as individuals, cannot avoid personal responsibility for our share of the evil around us. We are free agents, and we can make choices, difficult as they may be. But those choices can be seriously fudged and distorted by illusion and glamour, so that it appears one is making a different decision from what one is actually making. This is where religion as the cause of evil comes in. For devout but faulty religious belief can make a decision that is actually for evil, that is, for one of the countless crimes committed in the name of religion, seem to be a decision for good. That is, misplaced religious faith can make it seem to be a decision and an act in alignment with what one believes to be the highest reality in the universe, or God. We'll come back to that in terms of specifics in a moment. But first, what is religion then? Here too, as with evil, one can go on and on with definitional arguments. Some scholars, like Wilfred Cantwell Smith, have contended that the current ordinary usage meaning of religion as a separate, detachable, often separately institutionalized area of human life having to do with supreme reality and supreme values is really a modern concept, originating in the West more or less with the birth of the modern world, and modern separation out of different areas of life and knowledge in the era of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the beginnings of science. It began in other societies with the arrival of these same values and worldviews. Before then, what we call religion was so much a part of the total worldview and social pattern, Smith says, that one allegedly could not think of it as a separable and optional in the way that modern people do. When we say, for example, that I'm a good citizen, but I'm not religious. Religion then, he says, was more like what Hinduism means by dharma, or the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal Dharma, the ideal order of society that includes caste, governance, religious rites, and family life, all wrapped in together. Now, in some ways, I think this view of religion as modern is oversimple. Recent social history has suggested much more religious doubt and non-participation on all levels of society in religion, in the Middle Ages, for example, than the stereotype of the medieval age of faith allowed. Paul Rodin, in Primitive Man and Philosopher, has shown the same to be true even in primal society. That even in tribal societies, they had their skeptics as well as their believers. And certainly the Hellenistic world, the habitat of several of the masters of Theosophical lore, was almost modern in its panorama of elective cults and movements alongside the fading official religions of the Acropolis and the Forum. But what about the Mahatma's implicit definition of religion in this letter as those illusions that man looks upon as sacred, but which actually make him a bigot and a hater of all humankind outside those of his own sect? Now here I submit that we are cutting close to the quick of what we can understand and even identify with as a massive reality in our own modern or postmodern 20th century world, and in light of which it does not seem preposterous to me to attribute to this reality 2/3 of the world's evils. For here the Master's underlying definition of religion appears to be as an image or idea held in the mind, related to the nature or will of what one conceives to be ultimate reality, which leads one to do things that would be considered immoral apart from this ultimate sanction. It is, in a word, an illusion that one looks upon as sacred regardless of its moral consequences, whether to fight holy wars or persecute people whose faith is seen as heretical or whose gender arrangements are held to be immoral. Now, a glance at the morning newspaper or the evening news on TV will reveal that religion of this sort is still very much with us. More often than not, it seems, we read about religious wars being fought somewhere or people being persecuted, perhaps very close here at home, because of something they do that is held by somebody else to be inconsistent with religion, the Bible, and so on. But 2/3 of the world's evil? Maybe not just for religion under the conventional label. But what about religion under the broader but very pertinent definition suggested by K.H.? An illusion of ultimacy that entices one to do what would normally be considered immoral. Those illusions that man looks upon as sacred. And in what does that ultimacy lie? In God, gods, and religion, no doubt. But in the wonderful and terrible 20th century, now drawing to a close, how many other immensely persuasive ultimacies have crowded in upon God and religion? Ideology, nation, race, social class, corporations, and what is called their corporate cultures. Surely in our time, these have served functionally as religion, claiming to be the highest good, demanding the highest loyalty, even to the teleological suspension of the ethical. And how much evil has been done in their names. Think of the countless millions in our century alone who have suffered or died before their time as a result of 2 world wars, spawned by so-called higher claims of ideology or nationalism or both, in holocausts and avoidable famines in Red China and Russia, in third world countries as a result of unbridled and inhuman commitment to socialism or capitalism by local or international agents. Although the evil still done by ordinary human greed, selfishness, and passion is hardly to be minimized, and frequently flows imperceptibly into what we call the religious, for selfish evil can be done in religion's name, and greed can be masked as love of God. But what was really most memorable about the Nazi state, as about the communist and other totalitarian and ideological societies, was not the splendid spectacles of power and glamour that they were capable of mounting as positive persuaders, but the no less real power exercised behind the scenes to make sure that no other voice than that of the true faith reached the hearts and minds of any of their subjects. Here, I think, is the main key to the nature and power of their evil. For if one hears only one voice telling what is right and what is wrong, one is far more likely to believe it and name it as ultimate than if one is forced by the hearing of 2 or 3 conflicting claims to exercise that free agency which K.H. tells us is the legacy of our intelligence. That is a legacy the priests of illusion do not want us to cash out. Lately, as a result of the Heaven's Gate tragedy, we have been hearing a lot about cults. As a person involved in religious studies, like many others in my field, I found myself much in demand the day after that particular story broke. The telephone started ringing at my home at 5:50 that morning, and my day didn't end until I got home from the last of several TV and radio interviews about 8 in the evening. And the next morning, I found 16 messages in my office voicemail. Everybody wanted to talk about 2 things, cults and UFOs. Leaving the latter aside, I quickly had to come up with a usable definition of cult. Now, like many people in religious studies, I have had some problems with the way the word cult has become not really sociological, but a definitely pejorative term in popular and journalistic usage. It may have had an original meaning, linguistically related to a Latin word for worship, and a more or less neutral sociological meaning, suggesting a small group centered around exotic teachings, subjective commitment, and a charismatic leader. But all this has been drowned out by the pejorative use connotated by the expression dangerous cult, and terms like brainwashing and mind control. So in effect, to call a religion a cult is simply to say that it is a bad religion. No one calls their own religion a cult. The term is only used to label negatively somebody else's that one doesn't like. Like all such words, whether religious or racial or nationality epithets, the term enables one to distance and stereotype a group, saving one the trouble of looking at the particular instance fairly and carefully, in terms of different experiences that different people may have had in it and the like. You simply say it's a cult. I know what a cult is like. I don't like them. That's all you need to say about it. There are certainly books, for that matter, which call Theosophy a cult. I felt like telling some of my interlocutors when I was being interviewed for all these things that as well as being a so-called cult expert, I myself belong to not one but 2 cults. the Theosophical Society, and the Liberal Catholic Church. But I finally felt that I had to make some concessions to popular usage. I had to find a way of defining what cult means if we accept that it now means a bad religion. What is a bad religion? What makes it bad? But first, a little bit about Theosophy as a cult. The Theosophical Society has definitely had charismatic leaders. It is a small group with some interior commitment, although perhaps not as much as we would like. And in fact, it has a nice cult center. Maybe I should say cult compound. That seems to be the term preferred by the media. But a nice cult center, a compound here at Alcott, where they in fact lock the doors at night. As I found once or twice to my own discomfort. Although I think the intent was to keep people out rather than keep them in. But what Theosophy does not do is what any self-respecting cult, not to mention any self-respecting dictatorship, does, namely cut off all access to all but one source of information or ideas. Suppose that you were put into, or put yourself into, a situation where all, or virtually all the messages that you received by whatever media were from one source and proclaimed only one version of the truth. The likelihood would grow overwhelmingly strong that you would accept this one version of the truth. Above all, if you were still young and malleable and had never really known anything else. In a totalitarian society, such a regimen is imposed by force. In a more open society, people can still limit what they are willing and able to hear by an act of their own will, perhaps reinforced by an emotional and mental commitment to a group or a cause so strong as to blank out, before they really hear what it has to say, any contradiction to the group's version of truth. But although I suppose there are theosophists with that kind of a theosophical fundamentalist mentality, and there are sensitive points for many of us, I do not feel that such fundamentalism represents the mainstream theosophical tradition at all. Its teachers from Helena Blavatsky on down have always insisted that what they have received was partial and liable to distortion. Even more important, they have, both by precept and example, insisted that the use to make of it was not to hold it in a golden box as inviolable dogma, but to correlate it with the best of current science, religion, and philosophy. If something as porous as the Theosophical Society had tried to become a cult, in the negative sense of the word, as a group in which access to a diversity of ideas and information is blocked, it has certainly not done a very good job of it, with our incredibly wide spectrum of opinion on all sorts of things and our turnover of members. If, on the other hand, we had tried to affect the larger society and the stream of intellectual evolution by injecting certain ideas and mentalities as we could, without labels or claiming credit or further agenda, we have done somewhat better over more than a century. Turning back to religion and the larger society, I want to suggest that religion, in the bad sense used in the Mahatma Letter, is one with the bad meaning of cult. It bespeaks a situation in which only one view of ultimate reality is presenting by the reigning priesthood, all other information or ideas being blocked. Therefore, any action, however heinous by moral standards outside the situation, is justified if it is justifiable by this one truth, people having no other points on their ethical compass. To spell this out further, I want to go on to say that, in the larger society, I believe there is no absolutely right or wrong economic, political, or social doctrine. All need continual challenge and testing in the free marketplace of ideas. Socialism needs free market so that it can be responsive to popular desires. Capitalism needs ways in which the general will can demand social responsibility on the part of capital and management for health, ecology, and the non-exploitation of workers. Monarchy needs parliaments Parliaments need to be addressed and have their decisions carried out by firm executive authority. And so it goes. And so it has been when democracy has worked well within the social microcosm, including in the Theosophical Society. The great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and the Mahatmas who wrote the letters probably didn't believe in each other. But if they had, I imagine they could have had a very interesting and profitable conversation. Niebuhr emphasized the inherent imperfection and susceptibility to corruption of all human institutions, insisting that while the ultimate ethical imperative is love, on the level of society and social institutions, it can usually be expressed only through justice, which must impose limits, but is love in action insofar as it honors the sacred and eternal being of each individual without favor. Niebuhr set his face sharply against all the absolutist ideologies and their institutions which reached the heights of their power in his mid-20th century heyday. Fascism, Marxism, Roman Catholicism in the form that it had then. To be sure, there is a terrible beauty, an awesome purity of thought in intense ideological belief and commitment. Such belief can be idealistic and appealing, both to behold and to embrace. Yet in that very single-mindedness lies the fount of its evil. For one is so caught up in such idealism, it is as though in a hall of echoes, where one hears no voices but those that resonate with one's own. Indeed, Niebuhr thought that in a way Marxism or communism was really worse than Nazism, where he said that while Nazi racism and gross totalitarianism was so crude as to appeal only to those of debased or brutalized sensitivity, the communist calls for economic justice and a scientifically planned society were capable of reaching naive but well-meaning persons of much nobler sentiment, though the totalitarian end was the same. In both cases, one way or the other, there were holocausts, famines, gulags, terror, the destruction of fine and spiritual cultures like those of European Jewry or Tibetan Buddhism. All this, I submit, was the product and is the product of religion, under whatever form and in whatsoever nation, in the sense that the Master K.H. used the term. Now some of these ideological struggles have much subsided with the end of the Cold War. Has the hand of religion causing 2/3 of the world's evil lightened? Perhaps not. If a recent book by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, is to be believed. This pessimistic author claims that the planet is simply falling back into a perennial pattern of conflict between religion-based culture areas, of which the main ones, he says, are the Confucian in East Asia, the Islamic, and the Western. The shape of the century to come, he claims, will be wrought by tension between the authoritarian and industrious Confucian mentality, which underlies the emergent economically successful societies of East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and so forth, and the vibrant passion of resurgent Islam, and the weary Judeo-Christian West struggling to maintain the supremacy it once took for granted. I am not entirely convinced by these prognostications. I am optimistic enough to believe that instead the United States, with its certainly tremendous and increasing pluralism, perhaps exceeding that of any successful society in the past, may in fact be evolving a new kind of culture based on greater openness than any that has been known before, but which also can find the cohesion and confidence it needs to survive in valuing and rejoicing in that very diversity, maybe even leading the world itself to view its diversity in a similar light, so that relations with Confucian, Islamic, and other cultures may be ones of appreciation and mutual exchange as well as conflict. But in the meantime, all of us who share something of the theosophical or general humanitarian vision need continually to undercut the false gods of negative religion by pointing out, in season and out of season, that the actual religions no more need fight with each other than the right hand with the left. For they all stem from the same source, the ancient wisdom, and will all have their dawning, their days in the sun, and their decline. HBB, Helena Blavatsky, and Isis Unveiled spoke of the origin of true religion as God and eternal spirit. If we venerate only these, that is, the universal principle of creative consciousness and its presence within ourselves and all beings, we cannot go wrong. Though we may use many symbols and words to express it, so long as they are seen as like the finger pointing at the moon. In the Zen saying, it says that when a finger is pointing at the moon, you don't look at the finger, but the direction that it's pointing. If we look at all of the religions, the sacred scriptures, the creeds, the ideas, the practices of the world's many faiths as like those fingers pointing at the moon, they can be of use, and we cannot go too wrong. We and all humanity need to keep looking at the moon shining above the clouds of religious glamour and illusion. Thank you.